Okay, so I think we are just about ready to get started. I've started recording and set up the live stream for Zoom. Tom, are we good to go?
Hold on a second. Yeah, shall I admit the rest of the people from the waiting room and then we can close it, perhaps?
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay. Okay. Thank you for being patient, everyone. Okay, so I think we are just about ready to get started. I've started recording. Okay. So hello and welcome, everyone. This is FUC Pay Us. We are a weekly online speaker series facilitated by rent-burdened graduate students at UC Irvine in solidarity with the UC-wide COLA movement. My name is Molly Thrailkill. I'm a graduate student in visual studies at Irvine. My co-facilitator, Thomas Williams, is a graduate student in English. Our mission with this series is to both widen the visibility of the COLA movement at the UC, but also to create a space for conversations around labor movements, as well as the future of higher education and the university. For more information, we encourage you all to visit our website, fypu.org. We also have recordings of our previous talks there. You may also contact us at colaorparish@gmail.com. Tom and I also want to note that we view our role as facilitators here as just that. We're here to provide our energy, our resources to grow this platform so that these conversations and these vital discussions can take place. But above all, we are here to listen and to learn alongside you all. I'm going to pass things over to Tom, but before I do, I also want to mention that this is our 12th installment of our series, which makes this FUC 12. So Tom, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm sure, am I on? God, here we are, I'm not on mute. Okay, so I'm sure many of you who are here today are aware of the kind of the new ICE policy that was kind of widely publicized on Monday. And kind of as a response to that, I'm going to be reading a letter from UC Internet, from a collective of international graduate students at the within the kind of broader realm of the University of California. So, deportation threats are nothing new for international graduate students in the University of California. On July 6th, Immigration and Customs Enforcement issued a press release detailing new guidelines for F1 and M1 visa holders in the United States, effectively cancelling the visa of international students whose university instruction is online in fall 2020. The early signs from the UC are that campus administrations are working to find ways to safeguard their international graduate students from bars to re-entry to the US or removal from the United States. We anticipate self-congratulatory missives from our chancellors about the value they place on our diverse contributions to the UC community, with pledges to do the utmost to protect us from deportation by ICE. They may even point to the UC's decision to sue Homeland Security over the DACA program. The UC then would want to appear with us on our side, opposed to the racist policies of President Trump and ICE. These unironic messages will, of course, neglect to observe the direct thread between ICE dictating US education policy and outgoing UC President Janet Napolitano's time as head of Homeland Security, where she herself was the architect of countless deportations. In fact, hundreds of international students involved in the UC-wide struggle for a cost of living adjustment have been facing the implicit threat of deportation for half a year. This was particularly acute at UC Santa Cruz, where dozens of international graduate workers participated in a wildcat strike over their cost of living and were fired. Today, several remain fired, and if they are not reinstated ahead of the new academic year, they face certain visa cancellation. Here, ICE and the UC act more obviously in concert, just as when UC hosts ICE recruitment drives, or when Janet Napolitano declined the students' demand to divest from ICE-affiliated companies. That the UC has for years ignored the call from its undocumented students to remove ICE from campus will come as no surprise. We have then lived with the spectre of deportation for months before this communication. which is only the most recent of a series of steps toward our physical removal from the United States. For us, the new ICE decree is no more threatening and no more destabilizing than the UC's management of our call for a living wage. Amid the global pandemic, the UC cancelled their appointments, tuition waivers, and access to health insurance. The attacks on international students in the UC begin with the UC administration, led by Janet Napolitano, who mobilized the entire UC policing and surveillance system against wildcats for having exercised their right to protest precarious conditions and demanded immediate change. Indeed, the UC, as the sponsoring organization, builds the constant threat of deportation into the conditions of our entry and stay in the US. That is, we know precisely the value of our diverse and international perspectives because it is printed on the visa form we present to border officials. Our I-20 form directly states that our sponsoring organization pays us nearly $3,000 less than we need for living expenses for every 9-month period we live in the US. We supposedly cover this gap with our personal funds. Across a standard 6-year program, we each apparently muster up nearly $24,000 of personal funds without the right to work in the US beyond a 50% employment as teaching assistants just to meet our living expenses. The reality, of course, is that we live in substandard conditions, skip meals, and work cash jobs, constantly and variously imperiling our graduate study and our visas. ICE, therefore, does not need to elaborate a decree to impede us from entering the country. There is reason for our deportation inscribed on the forms we present them, signed by a UC official and endorsed by the University of California. The fact that we, as non-immigrants and non-citizens, do not have a sponsor willing to support our living expenses is already reason enough for refusing entry or removal from the country. We therefore fully reject any statement of care or concern from the University of California for its international students until all fired graduate students are reinstated and all disciplinary measures against graduate students and supporters throughout the strike are removed, until its workers and especially non-citizens are paid enough to meet their living expenses, and until the demands of the Undocu collective at UC Santa Cruz are met and disciplinary measures against them are reversed. Coming from abroad, we could not have known the conditions of public higher education in the University of California, its obscene administrative paychecks, its obscene police budget, its debt-fueled profit model. We will continue to fight as long as we are able to remain. Thank you. Now I'm going to pass over to our comrade at UC, our fired comrade at UC Santa Cruz, Tony Boardman, who is going to give a kind of an update on proceedings at Santa Cruz and with the Wildcats. So thank you, Tony.
Cool. Can you hear me? Great. Okay. Hi, I'm Tony. We're graduate students who went on a wildcat strike at UCSC for a cost of living adjustment starting in December last year, as you all know. So we gained huge momentum leading to wildcat strikes at UC Santa Barbara, UC Davis, UC San Diego, and UC Irvine. The strike, as Tom mentioned, resulted in the firing of more than 80 UCSC graduate students, and related student actions led to brutal repression by a police force costing the UC millions of dollars, multiple student arrests, and the discipline of dozens of activists through student conduct processes. So a few kind of recent developments. Facing unrelenting pressure from an administration taking advantage of the conditions of the pandemic to put down a labor action, and seeing solidarity kind of wane from the majority of tenured faculty, a majority of grads opted to turn in grades at the end of April, thus ending this phase of our wildcat strike. Even so, these grads remain ineligible for teaching appointments, leaving them without any guarantee of income through the summer into the fall quarter and beyond. And as Tom was making the point, fired international students whose student visas are effectively bound to their work status risk being unable to remain in the country. The student conduct processes are continuing for both graduate and undergraduate students. Faculty are also being disciplined through the Faculty Code of Conduct, and there are particularly egregious charges for militant students of color. Here, local and state police, who we discovered used military surveillance technology at our picket, have collaborated with administration, leaving some students with multi-year suspensions that likely mean the end of their graduate careers. While our statewide union, UAW 2865, filed two unfair labour practices against the UC, union leadership voted not to call a vote on an unfair labour practice strike, meaning teaching assistants were not able to go on a union-sanctioned strike this spring, despite a groundswell of rank and file support across UC campuses. But of course, we all still remain without anything that remotely resembles a cost of living adjustment. We're woefully rent burdened throughout a pandemic. So in this situation, we're incredibly grateful for all the continuing solidarity we receive. So I'm going to drop a couple of links in the chat for a couple of ways to help. We have basically spent up our strike fund on providing support for fired graduate students through spring and summer. So all the support for our strike fund is very welcome. There is a nationwide and international boycott of the UC, pushing for the reinstatement and the end of student discipline, for an academic boycott of the UC. And if this can be spread, if anybody wants to sign this, this would be awesome. And then so one of the organizers, Carlos Cruz, has received like particularly the worst forms of student discipline. He has been suspended for 2 years. And so there's a petition there to fight this kind of racist student discipline. Okay, that's me. Thanks.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Tony. So just without much further ado, I'd like to introduce Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, and with the university last words. Now, we're hoping that this is going to be more of a kind of discussion or conversation than necessarily a kind of conventional talk. So my co-facilitator, Molly, who you met just a second ago, will be taking stack from the chat. And she'll unmute you when it's kind of time for you to kind of give your question. So thank you very much, and over to Fred and Stefano. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to begin, and then Fred will come in. And I just want to begin by telling you how happy we are to be with you. We've been talking and thinking a lot about you, and we wrote this piece with all of you in mind, and we wrote some more of it this morning. So we circulated one version, but we thought maybe we'd just read the last little piece of it as a way to just warm up our conversation. But quite rightly, we really do, as Tom and Molly are suggesting, we really do want to be in conversation with you if you'll have us. So after I do this, then we're happy to get right into any kind of discussion that we can. So this is from a piece called University Last Words, and it's online, and we'll send this last little piece as soon as we can. See, one way to answer the question, what is the Undercommons, is that it's the discredited thing we've had a tremendous part in. But we have to be careful about what has in fact been discredited, and to distinguish it from what is only the job, which is to say the role play, the character. Because the university is an integral part and prime example of the experience economy. It's integral because it's where students and faculty learn to subordinate necessarily shared experience to the collective individuation machine of the experience economy. And it's a prime example because it incorporates so many aspects of the experience economy: sports, dining, dwelling, socializing, co-branding, that is the student brands themselves as, say, Northwesterns, and Northwesterns through the student brands itself as Northwestern, etc. In other examples of the experience economy, precisely because they're not taken so seriously, the role player knows he or she is in a role, and the role delivers a purchased, packaged experience designed to simulate what is depleted, extracted, exploited, denigrated, and alienated in the quotidian world of work, of antisocial reproduction, of antisocial life, That is to say, the very forces the experience economy is designed to further by way of false remediation. In other words, the worker who puts on the Mickey Mouse costume at Disneyland, or the worker who paints herself even whiter to be Snow White, knows she's delivering a paid experience. This is not to say she cannot take pleasure in a child's smile, but it is a job. The nurse who is on the job knows he can make someone feel better, but also knows the work is not the character he plays or shows or has, but the care he shares in restoration of walking lightly with the earth. Well, the nurse or Mickey Mouse know they're in a role. The university teacher, especially the critical, subversive, fugitive teacher, thinks this role, this job is the work. That what they provide in the seminar room or in the lecture theater, or especially in office hours, is the work, not the job as purchased experience. But the purchased experience is the credential, the brand, as any marketing professor will tell you. Why this matters for us is that we need to abolish this institution. And the way to do that is a general strike. And the general strike, as Du Bois and Marley tell us, is an exodus. If you think you can't leave because the students will be bereft, robbed of the experience of the university, you'll never go. You'll just wait for the master to come back, and he will. Now, when we say we need an exodus from the university, we're talking about an exodus from the job and the experience it produces. The dusty, rough, natty, naughty Zion of the work is what we have been doing all along when we refuse to enact the experience economy of the university. And when we feel our general strike enough to leave the job and take the work with us, which, as it turns out, is all we need and the only thing the university cannot do without. As I said, we'll share that last piece with the rest.
Oh, are y'all waiting on me? I just want to say hello and glad to be here. And yeah, we're just waiting to talk with all of you. So waiting for questions or comments or remarks and all that.
So as Molly's just put in, we are going to now be taking stack for questions. So if you could send your, or just kind of tell Molly that you'd like to kind of ask something, that would be great. Thank you.
I guess I'll say that we sort of pre-circulated this piece of writing that we've been working on in the hopes that that would stand in lieu of us giving some kind of a lecture, which we just didn't want to do. And we assume that nobody really wants to hear such a thing anyway. But for those of you who maybe didn't have a chance to read, the earlier version of it, one of the things we were trying to do is maybe clarify some things that we wish we had made more clear when in the book that we wrote together called The Undercommons, and in particular the chapter called The University and the Undercommons. And we felt like we wanted to, both clarify things from that moment, but also recognize the ways that maybe our thinking has, evolved a little bit, or at least sharpened a little bit since then about some of those issues. So, so that was the idea behind sending that text in, and it's fine. It's cool that text is circulated the way that it has, but it's, and it'll be nice to have a life of its own, so to speak, that way. And maybe other people will add to it too. But we're not thinking of it as something that we would want to publish in any kind of traditional way. So.
Okay, so I now have a number of people on stack to ask questions. So I'm going to go to the list here. Let's see if I can unmute our first person. And apologies, it's sort of a large group. Okay, Jay, are you unmuted? Okay.
Hey everyone. Hey, it's nice to be here. Thanks for letting me ask the question. I was wondering if you could speak more to something you wrote about in the piece. And I think both of you talked about before, which is the figure of the organizer and individuation. So talking about like organizing a general strike and also any kind of strike without resorting to like figures of the organizer, the individual, and then kind of going above that, like leadership in general, and also appeals to the university and the state. So organizing differently that doesn't resort to those models. If you could just maybe speak a little more to that and what you've presented already. Thanks.
Thank you. Fred, you want to start? Or you want me to start?
Yeah. So, well, thank you. Thanks, John, for the question. Yeah, I mean, I think part of what we're trying to think about, and certainly in the part that Stefano just read, is it's just this kind of that one sort of particularly insidious sort of effect of the sort of individuation machine, or the that is the confusion of maybe shared practice being eclipsed by the idea of an individual role or an individual identity. And so really on the most basic level, we just want to see if we can affirm, but in our practices, not just as a statement, but to actually affirm in our practices the force and the beauty, of shared practice over against, individual role. That's it. So, so that one, that's maybe a simple, there is organization, and we believe in that, the practice and the activity of organization, which of course, has disorganization at its heart, and then maybe reorganization too. But somehow something problematic happens when that ossifies into the figure of the organizer. And it's not just that it becomes a problem for organization, but it's also obviously an extraordinary problem for whoever occupies that figural position. And so I'll leave it at that. And obviously there's a lot more to say, but I feel like probably we should try to keep our responses short so we can have more. It'll be like a huge event of trading fours, so no solos today, just trading fours.
Yeah, and I'll also just answer briefly so we can keep going. But one of the things that concerns us in particular is that, if we are to think about joining in the organization that, as CLR James said, is already done, we as figures who've come out of the university have particular work to do, because we've already been cut in the figure of the individual moral agent critic, even subversive, right? So we're amongst the least prepared to join an organization. If, you know, and of course, all the struggle you guys are in is the living proof of how we're probably in the labor sector least able to organize because everybody is so fucking crazy in it, right? So we obviously have a lot of work when it comes to organizing. Now, all you have a lot less work than some of the people that you need to work with, especially people who have climbed through the ranks. Hey, Zoe, how you doing?
How are you doing?
All right. So yeah, I'll keep it brief too, but you know, we can't help thinking about ourselves when we think about who's unfit, you know, and needs to get fit for organizing. Well, us.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read the next question in Stack. This person wishes to remain anonymous. And the question is, what are some of the serious misunderstandings or misappropriations of the undercommons that you've encountered?
I haven't thought that there was any particularly egregious or serious misunderstandings, or another better way to put it would be if something untoward happens with regard to the book, it was not the reader's fault, but maybe there were moments when we could have been more clear, or certainly moments when we would have put things in a slightly different way. You know, like I very much regret calling a whole bunch of people who I don't know stupid motherfuckers. You know, that was not good. So, but I guess maybe the things that we would want to clarify, or that we wanted to clarify, maybe two things. One is that the Undercommons it's not a book about the university. It's not. And then the other thing would be, and the other thing would be that maybe sometimes I think we allowed, in the way that we wrote some things, to maybe people to imagine that we were sort of trying to exalt the figure of the subversive intellectual or the critical intellectual. And what we were trying to do is maybe more of a diagnosis of that figure, which is to say, not a disavowal of that figure, not a scolding of that figure, but rather a kind of way of recognizing that if the dream of the subversive or critical or fugitive intellectual is to rise above their complicity with the institution, there is no individualized path for any such rising above. And so the answer really isn't to rise above complicity, but to try to practice and activate an alternative radical complicity, which is again about shared practice rather than versus individual role.
Okay, so shall we move on to the next question? Okay, so I'm going to unmute Marzia, who is going to ask her question.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. My question is, I guess, the perennial question of how do we better work to be in, right? To quote you, to be in and not of the university, specifically as junior faculty and as graduate students. So is there something we should keep in mind, in particular, beyond what you have already addressed in the Undercommons and your other scholarship? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marzia. Maybe this actually ties a little bit to the last question too. I think sometimes when we phrased within and against, it seemed that we were advocating almost two different positions, that you would work with the university in the within, and then you would work against it. And it might be better to have said something like against the university or something, I don't know, but somewhere it indicated that, you know, we are constantly in an antagonism with the university. There's no moment where we're not, and there's no possibility of separating something that we might call our job from our work in the university per se. Especially because often what we end up thinking is the job's the bad part and the work is the good part. But one of the things that Fred and I were trying to say in the last part of that piece is that we're paid to do the good part with students, the experience, the seminar room. It's not that the job is when you have to turn in your grades, and the work is when you get to teach the students. Teaching the students is the job too. We're always in an antagonism with the conditions of work in which we find ourselves. So in that sense, I would also, you know, flash back to what Fred is talking about trying to find a more radical form of complicity, where rather than imagining we can extract ourselves individually from the university, we build up an increasing number of unseen accomplices who are there with us in the university, and who undermine any steady ability of the university to characterize us, to fix us, and to frame us, because somehow it's not just you. Seen or unseen, others are there. Others are in some sort of conspiracy without a plot inside the university. And then at the same time, we know that we can only leave together, because whatever wealth we have, whatever means of production we have, we only hold those in common. So thank you for the question, because we've been thinking about that. Obviously, we kept working for the next 15 years after we wrote that first essay. So we had to keep thinking about, you know, how it just really isn't a moment that's not going to be an antagonism. The question is, can there be a moment that's an exodus? And I think that's what we're trying to think about when we're talking about our thing, you know, as opposed to the struggle against them.
Okay. Next we have Yulia on Stack, if we're ready to move to the next.
Hi. Thank you so much for this conversation. I guess my question is about abolition, and if you could like tease out how an abolitionist approach to the university is tied to a larger project of abolition, abolition of, well, specifically police, but also how can we think about abolition as a sort of project that unites anti-imperialist struggle, but also a struggle within and against the university.
Thank you, Yulia. We, you know, when we talk about abolition, we're obviously doing so, you know, in the wake of other folks who have thought about it much more fully and deeply, you know, than we have, precisely so that we could say what we say. And obviously, you know, the tradition of abolitionism, specifically with regard to the abolition of slavery and of slave trade, includes a whole lot of, you know, important figures who we've read and tried to think about, you know, Douglass or Equiano or David Walker, Harriet Jacobs, Mary Prince, those folks. And in the more modern tradition, you know, where the abolition or the tradition of the abolition of slavery, you know, of necessity extends itself beyond the sort of false stopping point of emancipation. And so, you know, think of people like Malcolm X or Septima Clark or, you know, And then, you know, in the contemporary moment, you know, extending to that, you know, is Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore. So we're sort of trying to follow along in the tracks that those folks have laid down. And when I think about it, and specifically with regard to this more general conception of abolition, it's Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore who've given us a language and vocabulary to talk about that. So on the one hand, abolitionism as a general problematic, right? That it's not just about, it can't simply be the abolition of this or that institution, which for whatever reasons of exigency or taste seems to be at any given moment the most egregious of the institutions that prop up already existing society. I mean, it has to be a general abolition of all of those institutions. And once you kind of recognize the necessity of that generality, then it becomes possible on an analytic level to understand the relationships between these different institutions, which ordinarily we would like to think of as fundamentally different. And, you know, another great abolitionist, you know, whose work we are trying to understand is Foucault. And part of the reason why Foucault is an important part of that tradition is because he explicitly allows us to align to understand the alignment of the clinic, the prison, the school as fundamental institutional structures that all need to be abolished if the general, they can't be abolished one by one, and which all need to be abolished if we're going to survive. The other part of it too is, as Stefano was saying earlier, we're trying to understand the relationship between abolition and exodus. And again, this is an extension of the Black radical tradition, and particularly the ways that the Black radical tradition has always been lived on the ground, particularly by Black working class people for whom abolition and leaving, you know, have always been bound up with one another in various ways. And then at the same time, it's important to recognize, again, along with Ruth Wilson Gilmore, that abolition is also about presencing. It's about being present in a different way and building something present and for the present. So the question becomes, you know, how do we enact this general, you know, sort of entanglement of abolition, exodus, and presencing? That means doing shit differently right now, right where we are right now. But in doing shit differently right where we are right now, we leave the here and now. Okay, we exit that fucked up present in the interest of our own radical presencing. Okay, in the interest of the making of a new presence that we enact, and that's the structure of and the practice of abolition that we're interested in trying to engage in with other folks too. And all of, you know, I'm already speaking too long. I can just say that if all of that sounds abstract, maybe one way to make it quite particular, like I know it in my university or the place where I work, NYU, like at other universities, there's been a movement afoot to try to either, well, two things. One, to detach the universities from the local police departments that are in some sense entangled in the practice of keeping these universities so-called secure. And then there's been movements to also eradicate the university police departments. And I guess part of what maybe me and Stefano have been thinking about for a long time is that what if it just turns out to be the case that the vast majority of the policing that gets done in the university is done by administrators and faculty and not by the police forces, either of the university police forces or NYPD, for instance. And if we as faculty want to no longer engage in that policing, that manifests itself as a different modality of presencing in the classroom when we teach and when we do the stuff that we do. And we can do that right now. Sorry, I went on for a little bit too long. So.
And Molly, just if I can add one thing before we move on, I think another way of thinking about presencing is to remember another category of institutions that need to be abolished. And we're speaking about that in the piece. There's an institution called the artist. He needs to be abolished. There's an institution called the professor. He needs to be burnt down and then abolished. There's an institution called the subject, the individual, that's got to go, on and on. So, you know, we're given certain institutions through capitalism, and they're allowed to be called institutions, but we have a much more thorough job to do when it comes to abolition, work to do when it comes to abolition.
And just one other thing is, to talk about abolition as presencing, obviously it invokes, you know, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and she's the good person, but it also is an invocation of Heidegger, and he's a bad person. But we have to work with what the fuck we got, you know, all of it, you know, the whole pig, so to speak.
Okay, so we're going to do our next question. And just so everyone knows, at the moment, we have about 16 or so people on Stack. So we'll see, that may just sort of be the limit of what we can do, or we'll just see how time goes, Fred and Stefano. But next, I'm going to unmute Samasa, who has a question.
Hey, so Fred, I'm thinking in particular about your work on hesitant sociology, and a question that's circulating in some Black studies circles I'm a part of about, does Black studies need an exit plan? And in addition to that, I was rereading the Undercommons, and I'm thinking about paraontology and parasite. And Arthur Jafa, in a talks about how the Black artist or Black intellectual taking on the legacy of the African griot, but that the griot is both revered and feared by the people. It's not just a sort of reverence, and that the relationship is sort of parasitic in that the Black intellectual or artist feeds on the experiences of the people to create these works. I'm thinking about how Wilderson talks about how non-Black people are parasitic on Black energy, and how Hartman might extend that to being parasitic on Black emotion and performance. So yeah, that relationship between parasite, paraontology, and Blackness, and hesitant sociology as well.
Well, I'll just answer briefly because we're trading, but thank you for the questions so much. Are you a student at Irvine?
Yeah, I'm over here.
Well, the person that you have to ask about paraontology is Nahum Chandler, because pretty much everything I learned about that term, which is not that much, I learned from him. So he can tell you much more about that than me. And so I would say, in terms of this notion of the parasitism of the Black artist, I mean, you're raising a bunch of different issues. Yeah, I mean, I think the Black artist is a parasite vis-a-vis the shared experience of Black folks. And if, of course, let's say the non-white viewer is also parasitic of that experience, then that's an interesting encounter that ought to give us pause. If we can be righteously indignant about the parasitic ways in which non-white people, you know, feed off of Black emotion or Black experience or Black enjoyment or Black joy or whatever. If we can be righteously indignant about that, and I think we can be, you know, then that means we also have to have some righteous indignation that we direct towards the figure of the Black artist too, who not only is engaging in that parasitism himself, but is also facilitating the further development of that parasitic thing. So that just means that for me, at least, the questions that you're asking kind of, allow me to echo what Stefano just said, which is that, you know, the institution of the artist, the institution of the scholar, whether we're talking about, the Black artist or the Black scholar or the white artist and the white scholar, those are institutions that require and necessitate abolition and exodus in the interest of the presencing of shared aesthetic and intellectual experience. Okay, so if we make an argument against art and an argument against the artist, it's not an anti-aesthetic argument, actually. It's really an argument about wanting to claim and to protect the materiality of the aesthetic over against the immateriality of the figure of the artist or in the immateriality of the individual artwork. Both of which, as far as we can tell, are illusions, actually. Steve, you hesitant sociology. I learned all of that from him because he's the actual sociologist. I'm just an English major. So, but that's a phrase we get from Du Bois, and Stefano can say more about that if he wants to. And obviously, if you want to talk more about it, we can email about it later on or something.
Well, I guess, Samasa, the only thing I would add is if you haven't had a chance to read R.A. Judy, I came to him really late. You should read him because he's got a great comment on hesitant sociology, sociology hesitant. So I'd go to him. He has better things to say than I would about it.
And he has a whole other amazing take on paraontology too. He's got a new book coming out in October from Duke University Press called Sentient Flesh, and it's a great book. So.
Okay, so I'm going to read the next question. Let me just find it in the chat. And just for folks who are in the chat, I've just sort of announced a soft close since there are a number of questions on deck already. So this next question, what can we do to convince ourselves that support, care, social reproduction is awaiting for use if we choose to exit the university? What about those who have not developed the safety nets outside these institutions, who are doubly isolated, who have not found their group to co-exit with?
I'll let you go.
Okay, that's a great question. And I know it has to be at the back of everybody's mind all the time. I know it's at the back of mine. I don't have a university job right now. And so I'm always thinking about, you know, who do I got to support me? Who do I got to work with, et cetera, right? We have a great friend called Manolo Callahan, and he's been teaching us a lot over the years. He in turn is connected to a number of organizations in California and in Mexico. And for years, he's been part of a group of people who've been paying attention to the war on subsistence. And, you know,
what?
For the first few years, when he was saying this, and he was teaching us, he was trying to help us think about the war on subsistence, I kept thinking he was talking about the work he was doing in Mexico. I kept thinking he was talking about the conversations we were having about the Caribbean and Latin America. And the whole time he was talking about me. He was saying, there's a war of subsistence on your ass. Are you paying any attention to it? And I wasn't, you know, I wasn't. I was structured in a whole bunch of things, wages, households, etc., where I thought the war of subsistence was happening somewhere else. But the war of subsistence, you know, is on us, right? And what's worse, of course, we simultaneously perpetrate it and are the victims of it, you know? So if anybody should have been aware of it, it's me. I'm doing it to people and it's being done to me and I still didn't recognize it. And I could tell you right now, as I'm reaching in my pocket for, you know, rent money or whatever else, I wish I had paid more attention to Manolo, but he's still there and he's still teaching it and his people are still walking it. And, you know, me and Fred, we look to them to try to help us with ways in which we were going to actually, you know, take back our social reproduction, and with it, the heart of our social lives. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Fred.
Nah, you got it.
Okay, so I have another question to read from the chat, but before I do, Fred and Stefano, I just want to check in with you about timing and how many more questions, how much longer you feel you are comfortable carrying on the conversation. Keep it rolling?
Yeah, I'm all right. I don't have nothing to do. Pretty much.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so the next question, this person says they've been rereading this line, fuck sharing governance or the slightly more equitable distribution of extracted surplus, let's share needs. Can you speak more about what sharing needs might look like and how this might interact with the often confusing labors demanded of instructors to serve as caretakers of student needs as well as educators? Whose needs are we talking about when? Are we talking about here and when? How much we stack them as we move toward abolishing? Yeah, sorry, that's the end of the question.
I'm sorry, could you just say the last part one last time, please?
Sorry, I was confused as to the part that was question and part that was text to me. So the last part of the question is, whose needs are we talking about here and when? How much we stack them as we move towards abolishing?
Whose needs? Everybody's needs. I mean, now, of course, everybody's got different needs, but those needs have to be articulated. And then there's the shared practice of fulfilling those needs. And then there's also the shared practice of thinking and reconsidering what it is that, not just what it is that we mean by needs, but how it is that we regard needs. And for me, at least, you know, for both of us, you know, reading Marx, particularly on needs and on the refusal that Marx practices to distinguish between needs and wealth. That's very important for us. You know, so how do we cultivate the wealth of our needs rather than imagine needs as something that can be eliminated? And by the same token, how do we share those needs, which is also to say share the responsibility and the commonality of those needs And by commonality, I don't mean that, again, everyone has the same needs. What I mean to suggest is that everyone, we have to figure out a way to enact a practice which is predicated on the idea that everybody has a stake in the addressing of everybody's needs, right? That's what it would mean to share them. That's not meant to be a way of glossing over what it is that we now call inequalities or
17 hours
privilege or whatever. It's just meant to suggest that even the language of inequality and the language of privilege is already so fundamentally tainted by individuation that we need new conceptual apparatuses to try to understand what we think we mean or what we want to mean by those two.
I think, you know, one reason that, again, without minimizing that there is need, one reason to dwell in needs and its multiplication is to avoid the danger of getting to the point where you can think of yourself as someone who has satisfied your needs and has become sufficient, which is very close to self-sufficient, which is very close to sovereign, which is very close to being able to diagnose yourself fully and correctly as to what needs you might have or how to care for those needs. And the reason we're interested in the multiplicity of needs that can be produced is not only because that's a way of thinking about needs as a set of wealth of capacities and desires, but also because it keeps us and leaves us in a state of incompleteness, as Cedric Robinson would remind us to be. We're incomplete. The fact that we have needs and the fact that they're different means we need each other. But we need each other not as people who are involved in interpersonal relationships of need. We need each other because we're incomplete. We're not whole. We're not sufficient. And that's why we look to that wealth of needs as a way to think about being together outside of interpersonal relations, of the known quantities of needs and desires that are often presented to us in bourgeois sociology or psychology, etc.
I'm going to unmute Dee Jones for the next question. Dee Jones, are you unmuted?
I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. It's interesting you got to mentioned enacting a practice, and that's kind of where I'm stuck at right now. So I'm a PhD student, but in the last 25 years have had all kinds of roles in the university as far as students, graduate student, administration, faculty, all different kinds of things. And, finding myself at this point now, especially going through this process at this particular time of really dealing with that entanglement that you mentioned of abolition, exodus, and presence. How do I be present in this type of institution, understanding and knowing how institutional it is and how I am, I guess trying to be that person that is impossible to be, where you cannot rise above it in the sense of your participation in it. So I have all these different thoughts and notions about whether or not even to, finish this process and return to the academy in some official capacity, or how to engage with it from an outside capacity, and all these different things. And so, I'm really interested in that part of enacting a practice, and kind of what are maybe even some examples of how practice has been enacted. An example I can come up with is that recently our university released a statement about racism and what we were doing to combat racism, which we hate and all these kind of different things. And it really resulted in them saying in all of their words how much they support racism and how much they support the labor of Black and brown folks to be responsible for the eradication of racism at the institution and different things like that. So long story short, my response to that is just to do some wake work if I can, get to Christina Sharp and do Black annotations and redactions to that type of a letter and really recraft a letter that actually says what it looks like they're saying beyond the lines. Not as an artist, even though it's an aesthetic project. I'm just wondering, kind of like, for me, that was something that I could do for myself therapeutically. And as I circulated with people, recognize that I could find my people for Exodus in that regard. But I'm just wondering, kind of like, what are some of those practices? What are some of those things as we try and collectively figure out what are some of the things some people are doing to try and get at that?
Well, I mean, okay, so there's a way that I mean, I feel like there's okay, so I'll do the wrong thing and answer the question, okay, which is, for those of us who are teaching, we should stop grading and we should stop giving assignments. Just that, on the most basic level right there. Stop doing the administrative work of the university. Okay, radically detach the credentializing function of the university, which is a front for finance capital, and detach the intellectual and social and aesthetic work that we would like to do with one another, in the hope and in the recognition that doing that collective intellectual, social, and aesthetic work will actually be a practice of exodus, gathering, and presencing against the grain of the already existing institution. So I would say that stopping doing those two things for those of us who work in the university seems to me to be one possible but necessarily oversimplified answer to that question. The correct response to the question, it seems to me, on the other hand, is not to answer it, but to say, let's continually ask that question with and of and for one another in every gathering that we are engaged in. And let every class be a class on that. Let that be the curriculum. Let that be the occasion and the content of our gatherings, and let the form and practice of our gathering emerge from the continual asking of that question. Rather than anybody, especially me, giving you the answer to that question. That's kind of what I would say. And if that seems, let's say that seems I don't know, maybe sometimes I guess I get the feeling like maybe that's an unsatisfactory address of the question and it seems too abstract. But I really don't believe that it is abstract. I believe that it's absolutely material. Okay. So I feel badly about my sense that I just did something unsatisfactory, but I ain't nothing I can do about it now. I can't take it back. So I just, I guess I share your frustration, D. Jones, with all of these statements of solidarity and statements of fucking intent. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of that shit. I'm sick of the extra work that that it seeks to extract from me. I'm sick of the extra work that it does extract from me just from having to read the email long enough to know I don't want to finish reading the fucking email. Okay, even that's too fucking much. But, you know, but what I'm also sick of, and I'm sick of it in myself as much as I'm sick of it in other people, is I'm sick of, you know, the desire to be included in the institution. You know, he said, yeah, we'll include you in the fucking institution. And your job will be to listen to us make statements of solidarity. It's like a really bad knockoff version of No Exit. You know, the aptly named play by Sartre, No Exit, since today what we're talking about is exit. It's just that. You know, that hell, you know, let's sharpen it up. Hell is not other people. That's too general. Hell is having to read the dean's latest fucking email of her statement of solidarity, or his, you know. That's hell. And I'm sick of hell. It's fucking hot in here, you know? So I don't want to do that no more. And I don't want to be, but what I know is that, you know, what I always, anyway, I'm just blathering. I'm shut up. I'm only talking because I felt like what I was saying before wasn't what you wanted to hear, but I don't think I'm going to say any more of what you want to hear if I keep talking, so I'll shut the fuck up.
Okay, so the next question from the chat is, when you say the work, does it make sense to feel or name it as a spiritual thing?
That's a really interesting question, because I was gonna say no, because I didn't want the work to be elevated in that way, from work to the work, and much less, as we said, from the work to my work, which is the ultimate in a fantasy of elevation. But at the same time, I mean, you know, we're influenced by Cedric Robinson's reading of Du Bois' General Strike, right? As actually this runs through a lot of Professor Robinson's work, in which, you know, an aspect of spirit on earth is central, and an aspect of an enfleshed spirit is central to the struggle, central to what an exodus would be. So there should be some way in which the work, in a very kind of like desacralized, sacred way, is carrying something with it. But it wouldn't be the work. It would just be something like our work, or work that's going on. So, I mean, Fred and I, we're lucky that we get to talk to a lot of people like all of you. And one thing we're always really careful to say, and which we didn't say today, by the way, I guess, but, you know, I just forgot, is we know that when we come to you with the good word, that you already have it. We're not coming here to tell you anything, much less anything that you don't already feel in your spirit. We're just itinerant that way, you know, and we're expecting that when we come to preach about anything, that we're already preaching to the converted, and so work for us is already in that sense a spiritual affair, but it is equally only a spirit that can be understood collectively.
Okay, so I have another question from the chat, and we are still okay with time. Okay. So the context for this question is that the person asking is a student at Earlham College in the Midwest. And the question is, the university final words resonates deeply with everything that has been occurring here. Given that the type of destabilizing work needed to dismantle the university is collective, necessitating a general strike, what can be done about scabs or students who are committed to and benefit from upholding the processes of the university as is? I'm thinking particularly of white and domestic students.
Well, so that's a question that came from the YouTube part. I mean, can Adrian speak? I just have a question for Adrian's question. Not Adrian, I'm sorry, for Earlham students' question, I suppose.
Yes, let me see if they're in the Zoom.
Okay.
So message me, I guess, if you're okay with me unmuting you to join in. Oh, I forgot. This person has a mic issue. So I will unmute them and see if that works.
Okay.
Okay.
Hello? Is that working?
Yes.
Oh, okay, cool. Hi.
Right.
Hey. No, I just wanted to hear you say a little bit more about the scabs and who the scabs are. It's the first time I ever heard the word scabs used like that with regard to students, and I'm just interested in hearing more about that.
I guess I'm again thinking more of just my own university since I'm here now. I don't know if this makes it different from other institutions, but we have a really huge kind of institutional push for students to do things like volunteer, like do activism and stuff like that. So there's a lot of like really institutionalized path towards activism, which really kind of derails the whole spirit of activism in and of itself. So when you organize, it's very, very difficult to do that without, in a way that kind of gathers the people who have the same kinds of ideas of what activism is together. So in the way that we're describing, like when we say like make your exodus, right? That really made sense to me because I'm like, well, I think that makes it even more difficult here because when we have tried to do things that are similar or at least in that vein, we find that a number of students actually support the administration in the way that they're reporting our actions. Just recently, we had a Facebook group because of a number of issues that are going on right here regarding the administration and workers' rights and things like that. And we discovered that there were people who had reported to the administration who had secretly let them into the group so that they could monitor our actions, our thoughts, our responses without us knowing. So when I say scabs, I mean literally students who will cross the picket line in support of the board, the administration, the oppressive forces that prevent us from even thinking of making an exodus.
Okay. Yeah, so that's like some agent shit, like COINTELPRO kind of shit.
I didn't know if that was maybe a really localized question, but I just imagine that maybe other universities had similar processes. I mean, with every strike, I think there's always people who cross the picket line, so.
I don't know, man. Steve, what do you think? I think this is a really interesting question, and I feel like this is one that everybody should weigh in. I'm serious. I mean, I just feel like I feel like we should just keep talking about this one for the rest of our time. Like I really want to hear I have to say.
Well, I remember, I think at the beginning of your question, is it Ridwan? Is that right?
Well, Ridwan is my partner. We're both here. My name is Stella.
Okay, sorry. What's your name?
Stella.
It's not coming.
Stella.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, Stella, at the beginning of your question, you were talking about how your college is encouraging a lot of this sort of like institutionally approved volunteerism and sort of NGO work. Is that right?
Part of the way that we receive a number of our funds, particularly from like the Alumni Association and other partnerships, is we have so one example is our Bonner Scholarship Program, which intentionally preys on students of low income. They're required to go out into the community and do institutionally approved volunteerism for 10 hours a week, and they receive next to nothing for doing that. I'm actually part of that program, so that was my experience with it, and that is currently our experience with it. There are a number of other things that my institution is doing to kind of encourage students to continue to rack up volunteer hours that are then marked and put aside so that Earlham College can receive things like grants, et cetera, et cetera. So and we really don't see the direct benefit of whatever grants that they're getting. So I mean, that's to me like a direct way to shunt students into a particular kind of activism, a direct way to kind of sensitize them to thinking of activism in only that way, and then also to again extract our labor for nothing.
One of the things I was thinking as you were talking about it, Stella, is that, I used to be, maybe you guys have been in these reading groups where you get into a big debate about like reform versus revolution, whether it's in a Black Studies reading group or whether it's looking at the history of the European labor movement, whatever, right? But when you think about like the terrain of struggle that all of us probably on this call are in, when we wake up in the morning, whether we like it or not, or intend it or not, we do reform as a matter of just keeping the thing from falling apart. Every day we reform the university enough so that it doesn't entirely collapse. The ground of our struggle is already shifted far beyond the notion of reform. So when it rears its head in this sort of ugly way that Stella's referring to, where it's so institutionally accepted that the damn job is reform, that you are responsible for the fact that this system is unsustainable, untenable, completely white supremacist, etc. That's where you realize that, how could there actually be a position other than a revolutionary position? We're already doing all the fucking reform you could imagine. We're half sick doing it, right? We're half unemployed doing it. It's not always surfaced, in the negative way that of the college that you're talking about, Stella. But it reminds us that, our daily work, is a work of reforming a completely unworkable system. So if that's no good, which of course is not, then what but a revolutionary politics would we have, however you want to think about that? But in some ways, it would have to include the non-cooperation of reform, which is simultaneous to the non-cooperation of the job in our case. I might not say that if we were a bunch of police officers, but in our work, non-cooperation of the job is non-cooperation of the political position of reform. And by reform, I mean like, should we have shared governance? Should we have, better wages? We fight for that shit and keep the thing going all the time based on that already. And it doesn't work, and it would collapse if we didn't do it. So, in a way, when I'm hearing your question, Stella, it's helping to remind me, what choice do we have? You can't, as we said in the piece, or maybe we didn't, I don't remember if we took this out, Fred, but what would it even mean to reform some of these other institutions that that we historically have dealt with? You wouldn't reform a plantation, and the spread of the plantation model through all these forms which we say without in any way saying that we could even have a grammar for the actual plantation and its model. The spread of that kind of thing where you work all day long just to keep a totally unsustainable thing going up onto your death, you know, means the only position is exodus. The only position is revolution. What else would you do? Die, you know, which, you know, is what people are doing right now, just with a little extra help. So those scabs, you know, my fear is that I'm one of them, you know, because if what they're holding up is a position of reform against your insurgency, well, every day that I get a little job, I have to do some reforming work, you know. The question is, how do I do some insurgency work? And it's not even a question, because what else can I do? You know, reform is killing me. You know, reform is killing you. Reform's going to kill those poor scabs.
It's a tough question for me to think about now. And when I say me, I mean Stefano too, although, but if I say something you don't mean, you got to stop me. But, you know, we're older, you know, we're old and shit, as y'all can see. And we have, you know, the stuff that Stefano was talking about in that first piece that he read about what it's this thing that happens to you when you feel like, when you start to take on a role, you know, and you begin to, and you mistake the role for work, you know, and sometimes, you know, you want to take on the role of teacher or want to take on the role of mentor. And when you take on that role, you, in a certain sense, are also bringing other people into your sphere, so to speak, and assigning them roles too. And so this is the insidious part, let's say, of that kind of fucked up thing where, you know, you're perfectly benevolent, really cool professor who you like makes the horrible sort of maneuver of calling you his student. This is my student. You know, you don't necessarily mean nothing bad by that shit when you say it, but you're doing something bad by saying it. Okay? And I say that in order to say this. Part of me is, I got enough young person still in me deep inside underneath all this decay to have the same indignation as you about these fucking scabs, you know? And this other part of me where I've slipped into the role of professor in a way that says, yeah, but the people you're calling scabs are my students. And this is both, and what this means is that is both part of that work of reform that Stefano is just talking about, but it's also this other part where it's like, I want to absolve them of their sins of reform. And I know a little bit about Earlham College, you know, it's a Quaker school, you know, and I know that it, you know, does it come by its social conscience honestly? I don't know. You know, does Haverford come by its liberalism honestly? You know, all you have to do in order to know that there's some bullshit there is go to Earlham or go to Haverford or go to fucking Guildford or go to fucking Oberlin to know that there's nastiness there. And their contradictions are even sharper than the more bureaucratic kind of contradictions of what it means to be in a University of California system, 50 years into the wake of Clark Kerr. Okay, right? We know these things. I guess I'm babbling because this is a question that I truly don't have an answer for. Or what I would want to do is continually talk with everybody about it to see if we can continue to try to refine this question. Like, I want to restate the question, not to deflect from it, but to say this is one of those questions which deserves to have as many possible variations of its statement as possible. So one other possible statement would be, how do we comport ourselves towards the enemy? Okay, when the enemy is us. Okay, and I don't want this question to be one of these paralytic questions. It's not a question of paralysis. It's not a question that's supposed to induce paralysis. It's a question that's supposed to induce movement, right? And we can ask it with regard to less obvious objects. Because we've all seen over the last month how Black Lives Matter can be co-opted by any motherfucking body, right? Sprite says Black Lives Matter. Okay, Walmart says Black Lives Matter. You know, the NFL says Black Lives Matter. And then it turns out they actually mean that shit. When the NFL says Black Lives Matter, you know they mean that shit. Because Black lives have always mattered to the NFL, as long as, you know, going back to Fritz Pollard, for you sports fans, right? Which is to say, if an individual Black life, which is situated in an individual Black body, didn't matter to the NFL, they wouldn't have what's called the scouting combine in Indianapolis every year, which is nothing other than a big ass slave market. Black lives matter to the NFL the same way Black lives matter to Thomas Jefferson. And they did matter to that motherfucker, right? Intensely, okay? You know, they mattered so much that he was committed to the process of dematerializing them, i.e. turning them into, okay, so this is my point. So are the founders of Black Lives Matter therefore scabs? It's a serious question. And I'm not asking that question out of disrespect to them, nor am I asking that question as a way of deflecting the actual serious problem of how to kick spy-ass motherfuckers out of your meetings at Earlham College. That's a practical question that has to be raised. But then there's this larger question of, you know, I don't feel like there's any way for us to properly differentiate ourselves from the enemy except through practice. It turns out that it's not a matter of identifying the enemy, or even for that matter of disidentifying with the enemy. It's just a matter of continuing on with the practice. I guess maybe it doesn't even, don't kick the motherfuckers out of the meeting. We should either make statements to the administration about what we're gonna do or hide what the fuck we're gonna do from the administration. We should just do what the fuck we do. I mean, I guess I kind of feel like that about it, you know? But again, this is just all off the top of my head kind of shit, responding to your question, which is a deep question that we can't resolve today. So I hope, Stella, that you feel like that the dissatisfactory nature of our response is actually a tribute to the depth of your question rather than an attempt to avoid it. And if it's dissatisfactory, it's just because we don't know no better. But we're thinking about it now along with you. You know.
No, this is perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't think of it in such a dimensional way. I guess I was just thinking, like, you know, is there a way to identify, or at least in the lines of, I think it was in the undercommons, you know, how do you get your boss to act like your boss instead of your friend, which is what essentially the university is doing. And I imagine some of those scabs, excuse me, the students who I had referred to as scabs do believe that the university is their friend.
Don't stop calling them scabs on our account. Shit, please. I mean, you're not doing anything wrong. It's just basically, you know, your question, you know, messed me up. So I had to. I appreciate you for that. So. You got some thinking to do.
So Fred, would you like for us to sort of close out on this question, go to a fresh question from someone on Stack, or there's also someone who wanted to add to this conversation?
Well, maybe what, Steve, how much longer you got? Can we just maybe make a time limit or something because you, like another, I don't know, it's for like 20 more minutes or something. Is that okay?
Yeah, that seems great to me. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So.
Okay, so perhaps I'll just sort of briefly break stack to introduce sort of someone who wanted to speak to the last question, and then we'll resume the questions that we had sort of lined up before. So I'm gonna unmute BM Gray.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for the ideas. I just wanted to add, not so much to sharpen the question, I don't think just race curricular issues. So within the context of Syracuse University, after a series of racist scandals that had occurred over the course of the past few years, they have developed, and this is just to add more to this conversation about scabs, they developed what they call the social justice hiring cluster, which essentially, exactly, right? The absurdity of the entire situation makes no fucking sense one way or the other. But what it has done is it has incentivized many departments, including my own, to try and get a grab for more faculty members who can participate in this particular kind of sort of institutional structuration of activism. And so the problem, of course, as you can imagine, is what it does is reproduce the very violence against the very insurgent movements that are happening on campus. And so now the scabs are not simply hiding, but they're actually becoming institutionalized. And I'm interested in hearing what you all think about this. Did y'all lose me?
No, I heard you. I got you. I was just, Stefano, is he there? He's off my screen now.
I'm back. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. No, I was just thinking, I'm wondering if you're thinking the same thing I'm thinking, because, well, very briefly, I just want to invoke our mentor, our teacher. It's Martin Kilson, who was like a kind of a fountain of let's say, of sociological terminology. And one of our favorite terms of his is vagabond policy hustler.
Yeah.
And what, the righteous uprising and insurgency and expression of feeling in the face of the ongoing brutality produces then the necessity for the institutions, in order to try to maintain the illusion of their legitimacy, they have to express a sentiment, and we've seen that over the last 2 months, a month and a half, say. And then the further expression of their sentiment manifests itself in, what do you call it? Social justice cluster hires.
Yeah.
Imagination grants. I got an email for that yesterday. We have some imagination grants, and of course, what we have then is from under every rug, vagabond policy hustlers who come to cash in on that, and it's an old pattern. It's old. It's as perennial as the grass. Okay, and I don't know if there's much more to say about it than that. You recognize it, and it's disgusting, but you can't let it be so disgusting to you that it stops you from doing what you was going to do anyway.
Sure.
Which that's the thing, is what were we going to do anyway? I think it used to be that it would become a distraction that would siphon away energy from what you were going to do anyway. And now I think it's much more that it's not a distraction, but a thing that elicits disgust. And the disgust can almost become paralytic, because then you feel like you have to make an expression of sentiment against their expressions of sentiment.
That's good.
You know, it's like, that letter that the dean wrote made me so bad, I'm gonna write a letter in reply. Man, fuck the dean's letter and fuck your reply. Just keep going and doing what you're gonna do, because why do you want to, don't let them lure you into their noxious public sphere, I mean, is what I would say. But man, it makes you mad though, doesn't it? I was sick of that shit.
I was fundamentally disgusted by it. I teach courses on race and religion and draw from you all in my graduate courses, but yeah, this was something that erupted in large part because the university said, this is our way of responding, as you pointed out. This is our way of sentimentally responding to the uprisings that were happening. And so what eventually happens is now a significant amount of money has been doled out for people to come in and teach or be hired to teach these courses. And I told, I guess I shouldn't say this, but whatever. I told my faculty members, as soon as you name something as a social justice hiring cluster, whatever insurgent emphasis it had died right there, right in that particular moment. And so, of course, pragmatic demands. So people are clamoring to find ways to fit within this hiring cluster. And yeah.
But it's important to note that our presence in the university is a function of this same cycle.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about Black Studies too. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah, continue.
Yeah, I mean, our presence in the university, our presence in the museum, our presence in the Whitney Biennial, our presence in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, whatever. And which is part of the reason why we were trying to say, you can drive yourself crazy trying to free yourself from the complicity of that feeling. But it's almost better to just be cold to that shit, because like that, the thing about that phrase, to be in but not of, is black church folks know that anybody who you hear saying that shit is almost invariably a nefarious human being, right? I'm in it, but I'm not of it. Oh yes, come on. It's a way of marking yourself as pure. In a condition in which purity is both impossible and also undesirable.
Yes.
Okay. So it's really not about that. It's like, and I know I'm talking too much now because I done got excited and shit. I'm taking up all the damn time, and I set the fucking time. But one of our heroes, kind of besides the other folks we mentioned, is General Baker, who was the leader of one of the main members of the League of Black Revolutionary Workers. And we just are always fascinated by the fact that he never saw a contradiction between working for Dodge Motor Company and trying to destroy Dodge Motor Company. And he worked for Dodge because A, he needed to make a living, and B, he wanted to be around other workers, and that's where the workers were. So we just got to try to keep ourselves from feeling bad about certain shit that we really shouldn't feel bad about. People on plantation did not have a whole lot of moral shit about being complicit with it's like, well, these are the conditions that we're in.
Yep.
And so we gotta fight. Anyway, I'm shutting up.
No, well, if I can just briefly follow up, this is the question I was thinking about, the dynamics of interpolation, right? So we are interpolated as subjects for the university, even as we fight against that interpolation. And I was wondering, you answered the question, I guess we feel coldly toward that dynamic of interpolation, even as we fight against it. It seems to me that, I won't say it's inescapable, but that's what I've been really sort of struggling with I am interpolated as a subject of the university, even as I desire to collectively be in sociality and commonality with my students and certain other faculty members. So I appreciate you for sharing that.
If Althusser had been just a little bit more Black,
right,
you would have known that just because the police call you don't mean you come.
Exactly.
A lot of times you act like you don't hear them motherfuckers.
Exactly.
Right? but he look, I mean, yeah, I mean, part of it is, and of course to be interpolated is to be interpolated as a subject, right? But that means, but if you accept that interpolation, if you heed that call, implicit in that, and this is something that Judith Butler writes about in her reading of Althusser, that means you have already accepted a condition in which you knew to answer that call. And that's why when Stefano was saying before, the institutions that we're fighting are not just the school, the police, the clinic, you know, the jail, but it's the self, the subject, you know, that too. So, and he keeps saying this, and I'll repeat it again. This is part of the reason why for us, Cedric Robinson is he's our mentor and our teacher too. And that notion of what it is to be all incomplete, you know, is really crucial. So anyway, thanks.
Okay, I know you had said 20 minutes, so should we do one more question, or is this feeling like a good stopping point?
I feel better if we did one more question so Stefano can answer it, because I
Okay. All right, so Ben, you are up next. I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, thank you all for this conversation. I think and I hope that this question builds on the last two. You talked some already in this conversation and in the last words piece about the university like always trying to extract your work as surplus, trying to give credit for or take credit for, or like otherwise get its hands on the work that's being done. So I guess what I'm wondering is like, how much can you or should you be actively worried about preventing that? And like, is there an obligation to actively try to make the work you do untenable for the university's use?
Thanks, Ben. I'll start and then we'll give Fred the last word if y'all have enough time for that. The way what popped into my mind in trying to figure out how to respond to your question is, you know, some we haven't talked about, which again is part of the stratification, the hierarchization, et cetera, that they manage with all of us. And that's publishing, right? So we spoke about teaching, which we share to some extent, all of us, no matter our positions in the university. Publishing, of course, is a different matter. It's structured very specifically, you know, first of all, to distinguish people on one track from another, right? And then to distinguish where you are and all that. Now, everything about publishing, as we all know, is totally evil. And everything about it is institutionally mediated. And we end up doing all kinds of stuff. I should say, I end up doing all kinds of stuff that I just ought not do. Like if I get sent something and I think it's lousy, there's no way I should say it's lousy, you know, because I'm not saying that the thing is lousy. What I'm doing is I'm helping a journal, you know, sort us, right? So basically I'm allowing this journal or this, you know, me and Fred get a lot of stuff from books to read from, you know, like manuscripts and presses. And, you know, at a certain point I realized, you know, something I should have realized a long time ago, which is you should just say, yes, everything should be published. Everything. I don't care how bad it is. I don't care how stupid it is. I don't care how right-wing it is. Everything, right? And I'm not making one of those stupid arguments for free speech like we saw in the newspapers recently. Well, I'm making an argument for non-cooperation in the world of publishing, non-cooperation in the world of journals, non-cooperation. Now, part of that is that people who got tenure got to stop fucking using these presses. They got to work for them, for the rest of you, but they got to stop fucking using them and they got to stop going to these commercial presses. You know, we got to stop cooperating with this industry. We got to stop letting them mediate our lives, you know? And this is a step towards, you know, trying to get at what you're saying, which is In what ways can they exploit our work? Yeah, they're gonna exploit our work. But in the world of publishing, we make it awfully damn easy. And all you hear about is, oh, I did some free labor by reading something for American Quarterly. That is not the problem. You know, I'm sorry if you did some free labor. You're doing free labor all goddamn day long. You work in a university, you know, you're giving it away for free all the time. The problem is the very cooperation with all these journals and all these presses. You know, we can't go on like this, you know? And I'm not saying that every one of us can do this in the same way. I'm just saying we have to do it together, right? Obviously, you might be in a situation where you've got to do something right now to keep your job, to keep your rent going, whatever, that's fine. But collectively, we have to do something about publishing. You know, we should abolish all these presses and all these journals and just put all this shit for free online. Just share it with each other, you know, to the extent and within the differentiations that we have, you know. But I haven't heard an argument once you got tenure why you would ever go back to any of these journals or presses, except to help people who were outside the tenure track or who were on the tenure track or whatever else. You certainly don't go to them. You don't go to a commercial house to get your book published because you want to reach an audience. You want to reach an audience, it's a pretty simple way. Put your shit for free online. You know, Fred and I know that, right? Why is the Undercommons read by a bunch of people? It's free. It's online, you know? There can be no excuse for cooperation with the press. You know, it's a corporate press, whether you're talking about Duke or whether you're talking about Beacon, you know, and there can be no excuse for the cooperation with all these journals. And it isn't because they're making some money here and getting some free labor there. It's because they are the mechanism for the extraction of value from all of our work. So that's an area that I don't have the answers for, and I certainly don't mean to sound like I have them, but I'm pretty sure non-cooperation is a direction that we have to take with these institutions. Thanks, Ben. I'll give it over to Fred.
Because I don't have enough discipline not to take the last word when you gave it to me, and because you knew that, I'll be cussing your ass out later, you know. But the thing about it is I was just thinking about, I think what Stefano said is totally right, because, but they get you though, right? That's what's so insidious, because you get into this thing where you realize, yeah, why do people continue to do it? Now at the UC system, it's interesting because just because you get tenure and just because you become a full professor, you're still under this constant cycle of further evaluation. Like I got to write a evaluation report for somebody who's going up for full professor step 6. And it's a fucking joke, right? Because this person has already, they don't ever let you stop going for further evaluation, which is how they keep getting tenured professors with 7 books to write the 8th fucking book and publish it that way, right? And then there's the other deals where you're like, well, I'm gonna do this shit because what I really want is to be able to help 4 other people get their shit done, right? It's so you're right about that. There is no individual way to opt out of the shit, but there is a way for us to work our complicity so that as you say, we can formulate a common non-cooperation with that shit. That's really, I think that's really important. And if publication ban is one aspect of that, then there are other aspects of it too. I think with regard to teaching, for instance, the thing I like about Zoom, in spite of all of the shit about it that's uncool, is, and this is an interesting problem that's emerging that I think we're going to have to be prepared to fight. Because what's clear, the universities, they're spending all this time trying to talk about how what they're providing for the students is an experience, right? But like what Stefano read, what they're providing is a fucking credential. That's what you pay the $80,000 for. And they're sitting around talking all this shit about, oh, but the students want to be in person. If they want to be in person so bad, how come none of them come to my class? You know, when they sign up for it. And I ain't mad at them either. They got better shit to do. That's the point, right? So my whole thing is like, okay, you know, no, they're paying for the credential. That's what they're paying for. And you pay $75,000 or $80,000 to Harvard because Harvard's a better credential than if you pay $10,000 to whoever, to some other place. That's what they're paying for, the credential. So when students sign up for my class, they're doing what they have to do to get a credential. And the grade, all that, those transactions are for the credential. And so the university guards access to my class because they're guarding access to the mechanism which produces the credential. They don't give a fuck about the experience, right? So what I like about Zoom is I can let anybody up in there if they want to come. And what's interesting will be when the university starts to try to take our teaching and turn that into their intellectual property. Okay. They've already done that with research, particularly with regard to the sciences. So the question will be, when they try to say, well, what goes on in your classroom is our property. Even though they don't care about the fucking property, they just care about the credential, right? So how many people, this is gonna give us a chance to maybe create a distinction between, and maybe this is a distinction that kind of coincides with the one that Stella was talking about, maybe between scabs and students, between the credential buyers and the nerdy weird ass motherfuckers like us who just wanted to be talking about Plato that day, right? You know, and so, and it should be free for the ones who want to talk about Plato, and it costs money for the ones who want the credential. I actually feel like the credential ultimately should be bullshit, and nobody should be paying for that shit either. But still, these are things that I guess maybe that's also connected to something in your question too, Ben. So anyway, I'm shutting up now, and I will pass the last word back to Steve, who's morally obligated to say something to keep me from looking bad.
This is the point where I usually say thank you and give you all a break. We love doing this with you, and so we go on too long, and we love the energy that we get and the stimulation we get to try to rethink what we're trying to all do together. So thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to everyone who showed up. You know, you all can find us online if you want to talk further about anything, and we'll make sure that piece is out there if you want to talk about that. So again, Tom, Molly, everybody involved in the struggle, thank you very much.
And thank you so much to Stefano and Fred. Yeah, so thank you, and just maybe a reminder to, if Janet's watching, you can, fuck you, pay us is the name of what's happening, and that's what we'd like to happen. So next week we have Bonner Merch speaking about the public university and the Black Panther Party. So we hope to see you all kind of next week, and again, thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you all so much. I'm going to drop some of our information in the chat for those who are asking about where our recordings are and other information about our series. But thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much to Fred and Stefano. Wow, that went well.